Chapter 3, Aggression and Violent Crime. Aggression, the main goal here is to inflict harm upon another person who is in turn motivated to avoid that harm. So accidental harm is not aggression, and harm that results from a helpful action is also not aggression. All violence is aggression, but not all aggression is violence, and violence and aggression are also not always crimes. Now, aggression can be affective or instrumental. Instrumental aggression, the purpose is to obtain some goal. So this could be killing your spouse to collect life insurance. It could be self-defense. It could be military action. Affective aggression is impulsive or thoughtless and driven by anger. And the goal here is to harm the person. Violent or reactive aggression is impulsive, thoughtless, driven by anger, has a goal of harming someone, and is a reaction to perceived provocation. It often occurs in a flash of anger, and sometimes that anger leads to a delayed reaction, where this is then sentiment rather than anger. Now, these two types of aggression are not mutually exclusive. So, committing some type of violence or aggression could be both affective and instrumental. So let's start with some theories of violent behavior. Biological theories. The early biological theories are based in like how your body is shaped, your heredity, and intelligence. So in the 18th century, people were studying physiognomy, which is the study of your facial features, and that those features were somehow believed to reflect whether or not you would be violent. In 1876, Lombroso publishes The Criminal Man, and Lombroso talks about what he calls born criminals. He's heavily influenced by Darwin, and he's basically arguing that criminals are less evolved versions of humans. And so he calls them atavistic throwbacks. Atavistic means ape-like. And these born criminals had to have 5 what he calls atavistic stigmata. And these are traits that are reflective of less actually evolved humans. Kretschmer and Sheldon both look at what's called somatotypes, and that's your body type. And they talk about endomorphs, mesomorphs, and ectomorphs. So a mesomorph is someone that has a very athletic build, whereas an ectomorph has a very thin build, sort of like olive oil from Popeye. And an endomorph has a build more like Santa Claus. And Sheldon found that mesomorphs were more likely to be aggressive. Others have looked at things like food allergies, hormones, sugar, fluorescent lighting, exposure to lead. Now, most of these theories have not been very successful. Some have also looked at psychoactive drugs that are used to treat depression and anxiety. And we have several cases here where they've looked at, where somebody has committed a particularly violent crime, and it has turned out that they were on some type of medication. But it's very difficult to prove the medication is at fault. These individuals often have personality disorders and other conditions. So when we want to use something as an explanation for violence or murder, or an explanation for any behavior, we want to make sure we're using scientific research in order to explain that. Another biological theory is XYY syndrome, which is referred to as super males. These were men that had an extra Y chromosome, and that was believed to be related to criminal behavior. It is related to increased risk of hyperactivity and temper tantrums during childhood, learning disabilities, lower intelligence, and difficulty adapting to stressful situations. Now, some of the more recent research has looked at basically neurotransmitters, and animal research and human research have both looked at serotonin. In humans, an efficient use of serotonin reduces hostile sentiments and violent outbursts in aggressive psych patients. And some folks with a history of violent behavior show low levels of serotonin. Now, within our brain, the limbic system is the complex set of structures that are on both sides and underneath the thalamus. It includes the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. In terms of the development of our brain, it's a much older part of our brain and is closely related to emotional experience. Now, two researchers in 1939 talked about monkeys who had their temporal lobes removed, and they showed very little fear and were very tame. And so later research showed that that's likely mediated by the amygdala. By removing that structure, it produced a similar effect on fear and aggression. It's also possible to increase aggression by impacting the amygdala. So in animals, electrical stimulation of the amygdala augments all types of aggressive behavior. And there is evidence for similar research in humans. Now, Charles Whitman was a sniper who, in the 60s, I believe, went up into a bell tower in Texas on a college campus and went on a shooting spree. And he had asked, before he died, he had asked for an autopsy. And it turned out he had a tumor pressing into his amygdala. And here you can see a diagram of the brain. So we're going to talk here about the prefrontal cortex. So that's the front part of our brain. The orbital prefrontal cortex and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex play a role in inhibiting the limbic regions. They seem to play a part in evaluating effectively charged stimuli and signaling other critical nodes. So they seem to play a role in signaling other parts of the brain that are important. People have also looked at brain functioning by measuring it using something like an EEG. And this seems to indicate that violent criminals do have some impaired neurological processes. And so in 1997, Lacasse compared brain activity in 41 convicted felons to 41 age-matched controlled subjects using PET scans, and did find that damage to the prefrontal cortex impairs our decision-making and increases impulsive behavior. However, this isn't really a great study because they were using very violent known felons. And so the most aggressive felons may not be very typical. Ethology is the zoological study of animal behavior, and in particular, they look at instincts, our genetically programmed behavior. And this work can be traced back to Darwin as well. And there's two schools of thoughts here as to how animals acquire their behavior patterns. One is that it's genetic. These very complex behavior patterns can be passed on through our genes. The hydraulic model is saying that there's the expression of any behavior depends on the accumulation of energy. So they're looking at the relationship between internal and external factors, and they're looking at triggers. So what triggers that behavior? Now, one thing that is talked about a lot in criminology is social learning theories. So one thing is the frustration-aggression hypothesis. And this is put forward in 1939 by Dollard and Associates. Basically, frustration emerges when there are some type of circumstances that interfere with our desired goal response. And the amount of frustration, and therefore the aggression that follows from that, depends on how near you were to completing that goal when it got blocked. Now, crim students, this should sound a lot to you like strain theory. Now, the revised hypothesis also says that frustration doesn't inevitably result in aggression, but it basically creates a readiness for it. There needs to be some type of event in the environment that leads to somebody actually expressing that aggression. So the aggressive behavior is a combination of being primed to respond aggressively and cues that make that response more likely. So this has been extended into general strain theory, and general strain theory is written by Agnew. And Agnew basically argues that aggression is a result of strain, and that the key emotion here for that strain is being angry, okay? So being angry will then trigger perhaps a non-law abiding response. And types of strains can be either the presence of something negative, so that could be that could be a trauma, the removal of something positive, maybe loss of someone important to you, or failure to achieve your goals. Now, our aggressive behavior may be controlled by what's called cognitive scripts. And these are learned ways of responding that are stored in our memory. And we use them as guides for our behavior and social problem solving. It tells us what event in the environment must occur to bring about a particular response. So social learning theory is really a broader category of theories, but they emphasize how we acquire and maintain aggressive response tendencies or any behavior through observation, modeling, and reinforcement. So the typical child observes numerous instances of aggression in real life, in school, on the streets, and on TV. As they observe this and they observe the consequences, they acquire some knowledge of the rules of conduct. Now, whether or not they act that out in real life depends on whether or not there's rewards or punishments for that behavior. Now, Bandura looked at said that aggression could be reinforced by family members, and that's the most prominent source of our behavior. But TV can also provide a source of modeling. So the key issue here today is that aggression today is often seen as acceptable, and we often don't show the consequences of it. Now, perhaps personality theories are also at play. So, some would argue that those experiencing negative emotional states and psychological distress are apt to be mistrusting, opposing, attacking, and punishing of others. Some also say that those with excessively high self-esteem are prone to aggression. So narcissism is a personality disorder, and it's characterized by a vulnerability to threats to the self-concept. Narcissists have unstable self-esteem, are extremely sensitive to personal slights, tend to behave aggressively, and some studies suggest that narcissism predicts aggressive behavior in situations involving some sort of provocation. So what is a personality disorder? It's an enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior that differs markedly from the expectations of the person's culture. It's pervasive and inflexible. It usually shows up in adolescence or early adulthood, is stable over time, and leads to distress or impairment. They're basically long-standing maladaptive patterns of perceiving and responding to others. Now, the DSM lists 10, which are in 3 clusters, and the cluster that probably is most relevant to us is cluster B, which is the dramatic and emotional. It's representative of impulsive aggression, and it includes antisocial personality disorder, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorder. And the 2 that are most important for our work is ASPD and narcissism. Antisocial personality disorder is repeated criminal activity, lying, unreliability, irresponsibility, manipulativeness, disregard for the rights of others and standards of society, a lack of remorse, and physical aggressiveness. These folks often are charming, but they have an inability to form and maintain deep and long-lasting relationships. They're probably susceptible to alcohol-related aggression, and the patterns found in serial killers are consistent with this. So generally, people who are psychopaths also have antisocial personality disorder. Narcissism, we just talked a little bit about. This is marked by a sense of entitlement, exaggeration of abilities or accomplishments, a lack of empathy, exploitation of others, envy, and an arrogant and haughty attitude. These people tend to be grandiose and require a lot of admiration from others. If they feel unappreciated for their self-perceived talents and awesomeness, they're prone to verbal and psychological abuse. And they also tend to be paranoid and vindictive. So I think if you look at both of these, it's easy to see how each of these personality disorders could lead to violence and aggression. Now, another thing that's sometimes looked at is what's called boredom. And this isn't your typical, like, oh, I have nothing to do today, I'm bored. But this is subjective boredom within the person. It's an inability to respond to things and people around you with any real interest. These are folks show a lack of appetite for life, a lack of deep interest in anything or anybody, and they're generally feeling powerless and resigned. So they often then look for outside stimuli to fill a psychological void. It's related to a whole bunch of negative affective states such as depression, anxiety, loneliness, dissatisfaction, impulsivity, and hostility. All right, what about impulse control? Impulse control requires someone to delay short-term rewards in order to pursue a long-term reward. And both aggression and violence are also influenced by self-control. Impulse control entails resisting the desire for something that's expected to make one feel good. Now, in the short term, this may help us escape some emotional distress, but generally in the long term, it's not a good idea. The researchers also looked at what they call a weapons effect. So when they were looking at people's ability to control their impulses and self-control, sometimes they would put a picture of a weapon in the room. And just the mere presence of a weapon, either in pictures or in the actual environment, increases aggressive behavior in both angered and non-angered adults. Okay, what's the association then between alcohol consumption and aggressive behavior? So generally speaking, many folks who have committed a violent crime have consumed alcohol the day of, the day before, within the last 30 days. And you can see here a breakdown, is most common with homicide offenders, and then we see the next group that's got it at the highest rate of sexual offenders, marital violence, etc. So it's possible that alcohol may encourage aggression by disrupting our normal brain function. So the disinhibition hypothesis says that alcohol weakens the brain mechanism that normally restrains impulsive behavior. So it impairs information processing and can lead a person to misjudge social cues and lead them to overreact. But it's not necessarily a linear relationship here. Also, anabolic steroids in high doses do appear to increase irritability and aggression. Now let's walk through some types of violent crime. Homicide is the killing of one human being by another, and that means then that it doesn't necessarily have to be criminal. Under common law, it had to be a, quote, life in being. So this means a human being born alive and still alive at the time of killing. Before the fetus is viable, an abortion is not a homicide. An act, however, that hastens the process of dying could be considered a homicide. The death has to be caused by another, and the act has to be the but-for proximate cause. And usually the death as a result of the aggressive act has to occur within a year and a day. So criminal homicides can be divided into murder and manslaughter. Murder is the unlawful killing of a human being committed with malice aforethought. Malice is the general intentional doing of a wrongful act without a just cause or excuse. It's basically the intent to kill. Now, manslaughter is also an intentional homicide, but it's under extenuating circumstances that mitigate the killing. Now, a crime has at least two elements, generally more, but the two most important ones are the actus reus, which is the voluntary act, and mens rea, which is the guilty mind or intent. Now, you can be guilty of an intentional homicide even if you don't desire the death of the other person, if you engage in behavior that made that death substantially certain to occur. So how do we establish intent? Well, one way is through the deadly weapon doctrine. If you use a deadly weapon, it's presumed you intended to kill somebody. Deadly weapons include anything whose manner can be calculated to produce death or serious bodily harm. A gun, a knife, a rock, a car, fists. Intent can also be transferred to an individual as well. So say you're shooting at someone and you intend to kill them, but instead you shoot and kill the person next to them. Now, another way we can establish intent is if you intended to cause grievous bodily harm. This comes from Director of Public Relations V. Smith. A murder conviction was affirmed when a police officer, LEO stands for law enforcement officer, was observing stolen goods in a car and directed the driver to pull over. The driver then pulled away. The officer jumped on the outside of the car. The driver accelerated and swerved, causing the officer to fall off and be killed by an oncoming vehicle. Now, the intentional use of a deadly weapon also implies the intent to kill or the intent to do serious bodily harm. And in Commonwealth v. Malone, Malone was accused and found guilty of murder when he killed the victim while playing a game of Russian roulette. So because you're acting with the awareness that your conduct creates... Now, felony murder is a law that's in place in most states, and it's when a death occurs in the process of committing another felony. Now, usually that has to be an inherently dangerous felony, and the felony has to be the proximate cause of the death. So death has to occur during preparations or an attempt to perpetrate the underlying felony, during the preparation of the felony, or during escape from the underlying felony before reaching momentary safety. If you conspire to commit murder, but your accomplice actually commits the murder, you can also be charged with felony murder. Now, a conspiracy is an agreement between two or more people to engage in a criminal act and at least one participant has to take steps towards commission of the crime. So, in order for something to be felony murder, the acts have to be inherently dangerous, that they are mala in se, or they were felonies at common law. Most states will not apply the felony murder doctrine when one of the co-felons is killed by the police. And this comes from a case, Commonwealth v. Redline, and it's referred to as the Redline view. Murder cannot be based upon a shooting that constitutes a justifiable homicide. So when the police kill somebody who's trying to kill other people, that's a justifiable homicide. Now, murder is further broken down into degrees. First-degree murder is committed with premeditation and deliberation. So it's a cool mind capable of reflection that did in fact reflect for a short period of time. It only needs to be seconds. Murder in the commission of or attempted commission of certain inherently dangerous felonies is also first degree. So that's felony murder is first degree. So we need to show that premeditation and deliberation existed. That can be done by showing prior possession of the murder weapon, surreptitious approach towards the victim, so sneaky approach towards the victim, prior threats to do violence to the victim, and deliberate inflictions of wounds to vital parts of the body. If you poison someone, that's first degree murder. If you lie in wait, that's first degree murder. Now, second degree murder is any murder that's not first degree. So it's, again, killing with malice aforethought, but without premeditation and deliberation. So the killer lacks the capacity to deliberate. And that could be prevented maybe by something like intoxication. So it's a killing, also a killing that results from an act done with intent to do great bodily harm, or that results from an act done with a wanton and willful disregard of an unreasonable human risk. Some places include murders committed in the course of a felony that is not listed under first degree. So if you were embezzling and you committed a murder in the course of the embezzlement. All right, so that covers murder. What about manslaughter? Voluntary manslaughter is the intentional homicide under extenuating circumstances that mitigate but do not justify or excuse the killing. So this is a heat of passion killing, and it's caused by adequate provocation. And the law defines what is adequate provocation. So there needs to be legally adequate provocation. The killing must have been in a sudden heat of passion, so it immediately follows that provocation. And there needs to be a causal connection between the provocation, the passion, and the fatal act. So fighting words are not adequate provocation, but some courts will allow fighting words in combination with some other circumstances. So X telling Y that he raped X's daughter is considered adequate provocation. Mutual combat that is not deadly by design is manslaughter. Discovering your spouse in the act of committing adultery requires sexual intercourse. Anything short of sexual intercourse does not count, and you must be married. So if you're engaged or dating, it doesn't count. Resisting lawful arrest is not a defense or excuse either, so you don't get to kill the police officer while resisting lawful arrest. Now, heat of passion requires that the act would inflame the passion of a reasonable person and cause that person to act from that passion rather than reason. So in Better v. Director of PR, the defendant was jeered at by a prostitute with whom he was having sex, and he killed her in a rage. Now, the court said basically he was impotent, and the court said that that isn't material enough to constitute provocation. Now, how long of a cooling off period do we need? Well, that's measured by the reasonable order. Manslaughter could be involuntary, which is an unintentional homicide committed without malice that's neither justified nor excused. So criminal negligence manslaughter is when you do something that has a high degree of risk of death or serious injury. An unlawful act manslaughter occurs in the commission of an unlawful act, so like a traffic death. Now, sometimes homicide is not criminal, and that's when it is justifiable. So a justifiable homicide is self-defense, defense of others, and a killing under public authority. So self-defense employees could employ deadly or non-deadly force. Deadly force is likely or intended to cause death. Non-deadly force is justified when a defendant is threatened by an assailant that they believe is inflicting or about to inflict unlawful bodily harm. Now, in order to argue self-defense, you have to believe you are in danger of death or great bodily harm and that it's necessary to use deadly force to prevent it. And that threat needs to be imminent, about to happen. Now, assault and battery often get used interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. An assault is an attempted battery, and assault involves no actual contact. It's an attempt to inflict harm or place someone else in fear of being harmed. But the fear has to be reasonable, and the offender has to have the apparent intent and present ability to commit a battery. Now, the battery is the actual unlawful application of force that does require actual contact. Mayhem is the infliction of an injury that permanently renders a victim less able to fight or defend themselves. So it also includes permanent disfigurement, and it's often treated as aggravated assault under the law. Now, under common law, rape only referred to unlawful sexual intercourse with a female without her consent. Today, it's penetration without consent, and it doesn't have any gender requirements. Now, if someone has sex with someone through fraud or trickery, that's called fraud in the factum. So a woman's having unlawful intercourse but thought she was with her husband, or for example, you consented to a gynecological procedure but the man has unlawful sexual intercourse with you. Now, statutory rape is unlawful sexual intercourse based on the age of consent. In Massachusetts, that's 16. The key here is consent needs to be freely given. Not for statutory rape, for rape in general. Domestic violence is often not a separate crime. It's assault, it's battery, it's harassment, stalking, but then the relationship makes it domestic. So domestic doesn't necessarily mean, there's a difference between domestic violence and intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence means somebody that you are currently in a dating relationship with, whereas domestic violence can include it's people you're living with. So if you got in a physical altercation with your roommate here on campus, that would be domestic violence because you live together. Finally, in 1993, marital rape was outlawed. Prior to this, you could rape your wife or have sex with her without her consent. And in 1994, the Violence Against Women's Act declared that everybody has the right to be free from crimes of violence that are based in gender. And that wraps up our chapter on violence and aggression.